Roseanne, you are a second-year anthropology PhD student here at the University of California, Riverside. You serve on multiple committees, such as the Graduate Student Researchers in Areas of Native American Studies Society and the Indigenized UCR Project. With this episode coming out the day after Thanksgiving and during Native American Heritage Month, the school wanted to take a moment to recognize Native American history and issues. Colonialism caused disease, violence, and displacement within the Native American community. Can you speak to the difference between rural and urban Native Americans and the intentions and implications of the 1953 Indian Termination Act and the Relocation Act of 1956?
Sure. Well, to start off with, I can't really speak for others that have been raised on the reservation because I haven't. So basically, I've been considered more urban. For me, it was a little bit difficult because I felt disconnected at times. Specifically, I mean, we would go back to the location where our family is from, which is New Mexico. And, it was kind of nice to kind of reconnect, but living most of the year, basically, in the LA area, we didn't really connect with anybody, nor did we even know that there was any Native Americans in the area. Specifically because in my time growing up, it wasn't recommended to say that we were Native, and because of the discrimination that happened, my mom and her siblings and my grandpa and grandma actually left that area because of the fact that there was a lot of discrimination, specifically in schools. So she would tell me stories about how they would keep the children, the Native children, behind, and they would be behind every year. They would, be left behind. So it was really important to my grandma and my grandpa to try and get them out of there so that they could, progress and go to school and not be held back, year after year. So because of that, we ended up actually, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but we ended up in the California and Los Angeles area. And of course, we didn't advertise that we were Native. So therefore, we didn't really reach out to see if there was other people in the community that were like us. So I did have a lot of displacement, as well as my cousins did too. And I think I lived with that for a long time and not really knowing that it was affecting me until actually when I came to UCR and became very involved in the Native community there. So that kind of, it really helped me get reconnected with my culture. And it was really nice to have, I guess, just a finality, just kind of going back, and reconnecting with people and my culture that I haven't had before.
Wonderful. And we have spoken previously, but I know your family has personal relations with the Relocation Act and the Termination Act. Can you? I know you can't speak for everyone, but maybe you could give us just a small glimpse into your family's history with those policies.
As far as the Termination Act, what happened basically was um, when the government actually went into contracts with different Native communities, tribes, um, everything was okay. And, well, not okay, but what the contract said, basically, the natives were going by that. With the Termination Act, the government came along and decided to sever those contracts, which caused a lot of Native tribes to lose basically their status in the government, which meant that a lot of them were no longer recognized. So that was an issue, and that came about as to trying to decrease the amount of benefits that Native people would get that they were promised. So that started a kind of, or enhanced the tensions between Native Americans and the government. As far as the Relocation Act, what happened was, and like I was talking about before with my mom, but there was like propaganda and advertisement for natives, and they basically sold it as, oh, you know, you're going to have a great life and you can come over here to LA and have your own home. But what actually happened, it was kind of the idea was to bring Native Americans over to do crop work. So in our case, my grandpa came over, and with the idea that they were going to be in a home of their own and they were going to be working at a great job. And so what actually happened was that they ended up, they found themselves in tents, you know, out there by the fields, in the fields. And they lived out in these tents who would have, they had, didn't have any kitchens. They were just basically tents that you would find out in, like someone who was out in war. They would just sleep under these tents. And so there was no kitchen, there was no bathrooms, everything was, you know, communal bathrooms. They'd have outhouses. And because they had left everything at home in New Mexico, they they didn't have a lot there, and they ended up staying there for 6 months. They lived in these tents, which meant that my mom and her siblings would leave, you know, they wake up early, work in the fields, and then go to school. She was 8 when this was going on. And then once they were done with school, they'd come back and work the fields again. Um, so a lot of it was sold as, you know, this is the American dream, for lack of a better phrase. And it turned out not to be. They were just used as field workers and were living in horrible conditions.
It's so disheartening to hear that. And it's upsetting that, you know, I think almost every year, at least in elementary school in history, we would start the year off with Native American history. Yet, without my own research and without speaking to you, I was unaware of these policies that occurred in the 50s, and their implications and what it was really like, and why they came to be. And it's very upsetting. And it, you know, I know that the differentiation between reservations and then leaving and maybe not being able to come back, or I know it can be difficult to access reservations, and just that separation, which adds to what you were talking about, the displacement. And that is, it's just really upsetting. And I hope more Americans, every American, learns more about Native American history and how we came to be today, and where Native Americans are today,
Mhm.
and why they need more attention. So.
Yeah,
And that
I think the one thing that was probably the worst part of this, the relocation, was the fact that my grandpa really didn't know that this was what was going on. He really believed that this was going to be you know, better for his family. And yes, they did leave a lot of stuff behind. And because of some of the policies and rules, no, they weren't able to go back to the reservation. However, his mom was actually one of a lot of children that went to the boarding school and of the native, the Indian boarding schools. And she was actually, they tried to assimilate all of them by actually, you know, deterring them, actually, you know, by punishment, for them not to speak their language or practice their spirituality. So this is kind of, it was kind of a progression how it went, you know, to basically get the natives away from their culture and the way that they practice and their everyday lives. So it, and of course, like I said, my grandpa had no idea that that's what was going on to the day he died. He didn't know that that's what had happened. So
and that narrative is lost largely, like Maddie was saying, you know, it's so disheartening to hear, and that for the policy that was created at that time, that implication is disastrous for a family like that. And to
mhm,
have just not have that knowledge. And I know, like, I'm currently thinking back to my time in like high school learning about American history. And you know, they mentioned briefly about like the Trail of Tears, but then it stops there. They don't really tell you the like this kind of this narrative about what really happened, and how disastrous that can be to the future of Native culture in this nation.
right. Well, we're finding, and I do, you know, I kind of focus on this work too, where there's a term called historical trauma. And we're finding that generation after generation, when they go through trauma over and over again, it has an effect. It changes you and the children that to come. So there is a problem. We see a lot of not only mental health issues, but a lot of physical issues too that we have to deal with Native American people. So it is very, very, it took a lot out of our people to go through that. And it was just, in every way, from different perspectives, it was happening, in an attempt to kill their culture. So yeah.
That that's just so hard to hear. But um, looking to the future, there are some rumors that President-elect Joe Biden is considering Congresswoman Deb Haaland of New Mexico for Secretary of the Interior. If nominated to this position, she would oversee the agency in charge of tribal affairs and public lands. She would also be the first Native American cabinet member in our history. So speaking to kind of that disenfranchisement of natives that we had just talked about, how is this representation at this kind of a level so important, and is it changing the tide in any way?
I think it's highly important. I think it's very beneficial. Um, if you ask me, I don't think that's enough, but it is a step in the right direction. For a long time, we have felt that we're not being heard, and we still feel that way. I think a lot of times people think of natives as in history. They don't think of us as here. It was kind of interesting. We had a guest speaker at one time who's Navajo, and she's a surgeon. And she did a speech gave a talk in the medical school. And the first thing she did was ask all the natives in the audience to please stand up. And people were kind of looking around like, wow, these people who we see are actually native. So I think we've all felt kind of invisible, as a people, as a nation. Um, but certainly it is going in the right direction. Um, I hope, my hope is that people will listen. I mean, we can put people in those positions, but it doesn't do any good if nobody listens, and just putting someone in that position is not enough. So hopefully they'll listen to her, and they'll listen to the other natives that are in those higher ranks of the government, and really pay attention to what these people need, because there's, they are the leading people that are getting infected with COVID right now. They're the ones that are highest rate of deaths. When it comes to healthcare, they're the last on the list. So, we talk about disparities. They're suffering all kinds of different disparities. There's economic problems, there's healthcare issues, there's, I could just go down the list, it would take forever. But knowing that we are the last on the list, it's time that we at least come up to, up to par. I mean, I'm not, that would be great. But it is concerning, and I hope that they listen, and I hope that they take everything seriously that our Native representatives have to say. It is highly important, and I think once that happens, I believe that things will get on the road to, being corrected. So hopefully that's what will happen.
Talking about that representation, the U.S. House of Representatives will have its highest number of Indigenous representatives, including a record number of 3 Native American women elected just this month. Indigenous populations played a major role in key swing states such as Arizona and Wisconsin, where small margins really helped the Democrats. Many are saying that Native Americans are invisible no more. Time will tell with that, but what do you think the Biden-Harris agenda should confront? And how can they aid in the Indigenous population and their issues? What do you think needs to be done to really push the Native American issues to the forefront to hopefully get back on that track, that right track you were talking about?
Well, I really believe that they should go to the communities and ask them, because they're the ones that know the best of what their communities need. I really think that they should take the time to go and talk to the community leaders, and the tribal leaders and the people that are in the tribes, and ask them, what is it that you'd want us to do for you? How can we help? I think so much has, one of the problems is that a lot of people or government talks to at us and tells us, this is what we feel that you need, rather than actually asking and actually having a conversation and letting the people tell them, this is what we need. This is how we see that you do this. Um, I think that has been lost. And if, there's a big push, especially in UCR, to talk about community-based research, which I feel is so important, because, typically academia feels that they're the ones that are the experts, and they go and tell these people in the community of marginalized people what they need. We're doing the study and we've learned that this is what you need. Well, it doesn't really work that way, because these people have lived in these communities for generations, and they've heard and they've suffered and they experienced all kinds of different things. They know better of what is needed for their communities. So that's the one thing I'd say. If you want to know anything, if there's anything I could actually recommend to you, is to go into those communities and talk to them and ask them, what can I do for you?
I love that. Do you believe that Native Americans living on reservations would perhaps ask for different things than urbanized Native Americans? Do you think there would be a difference, that they should actively seek out both groups and see if there's a difference, or if collectively there seems to be this call to action?
I believe so, because there are different issues that each experiences. You find some of the natives that are in the rural areas. I mean, for instance, there's some tribes that are just across the state line in Arizona that have no electricity, whereas urban natives that do. So, but they might be experiencing different issues of healthcare, for instance, or jobs, that they need, or education is a big one. Specifically here in UCR, we're surrounded by tribes all around. As a matter of fact, a Cahuilla man was actually the one that got UCR started, Rupert Costo. And, we only have 1% or a little or less of the student population is Native.
Wow.
So that's what I mean about, yes, that is a national issue, but, having these different issues that each one in different areas would have, you would have to actually go into that area and find out and ask them, what is it that you need and how can we help you? And let them tell you, exactly what's needed. Now, in urban areas, it might be a little bit more difficult because they're in every different, area, LA, it could be in San Diego. So it might be a little bit more difficult, whereas in the reservations, the community tends to stay more together. But, it still needs to be done as far as how do we, asking them,
And
to be, go ahead, sorry.
you were saying?
They just need to ask the people,
Right.
on how to help and what they need. So,
Yeah.
and then follow through.
Yes.
I think that's the most important thing, is once they tell you what they need, then just, do it, follow through, and make sure also that it continues. I mean, that's another issue we have a lot of, is that, we'll go in there as researchers and say, we're going to help you, but then the minute the study is done, they leave. And so the natives that community may be better or not, depending on what happened. They can end up going back or be worse, So I think that that's what is really important. If you're going to help, I mean, first ask, but then if you're going to help, please keep it going. Don't just take everything back that you offered, or just stop, with that. So I think that's the most important thing, is how do we not only help, but continue that help.
What, and I was going to ask, because, as we kind of talk about, as we look back to those policies that were implemented way back when, we're seeing that there were implications that were disastrous for the communities. What can we learn from those instances when we start to go back to the table, or when the new House of Representatives, with the Native American representation that is unprecedented, but also very, very great to see. When they go to the table, what can they learn from these, from history? What steps can we take in the future that ensure that we've done right by the wrongs that we've done in the past?
I think the first step and the major step is to be transparent and not teach something that's romanticized. We in California, we have the mission era that all fourth graders, I believe, has to go out and do this project with missions, where in fact there was a lot of, of death around that. A lot of natives were the ones that built those missions, but under duress. We had a lot of loss of lives, children's lives too. There was a lot of problems, issues that came across with that, but nobody talks about that. They don't ever, they forget about that part, or just stop at that point where they don't really explain, exactly what happened. We've just recently, I think they just gave a grant to a student that was going to talk about that and actually put that in age appropriate, of course, in the textbooks to teach the children the truth about that. And I think that's what's missing. So if we really come out with the truth and recognize what happened, I think that's a huge step as to learning what happened and how can we correct it from now on. It's going to take a while. I mean, it took how many hundreds of years, that has happened. So you can't just turn it around one night, but realizing and recognizing what happened and how all these disparities evolved because of those issues, I think is a step in the right direction.
My goodness. Roseanne, thank you so much, so much for joining us. This is such an important topic, and it shouldn't be discussed only because of a holiday or Native American Heritage Month. Of course, it's good that it does take a time to recognize it, but this is something that, to your point, is going to take a very, very, very long time to address and then begin to correct. So I'm just so happy that you came on to give a voice to the Native American community, and I hope our listeners and those watching take that extra step themselves to do some research and really dig a little deeper to find out what were we taught compared to maybe what really happened. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. It's been really informative and amazing.
Thank you for having me.